Mr. Fernandez, Mr. Levine, President Pumariega, Mitchell, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, good morning.
Good morning.
All right, got an enthusiastic crowd here. I just asked real quick, if you haven't set your cell phones on the silent position, that you please do so at this time. This is the Mike Fernandez Global Business Leadership Series at your Miami-Dade College, and today we're broadcasting live from the innovation hub of the region, MDC's Idea Center. It's wonderful to have this series back with a small live audience of students and community leaders in this room, and many others joining us on the live stream. I'm Juan Mendieta, the Director of Communications here at Miami-Dade College, and on behalf of our esteemed President, Madeline Pumariega, who is in Tallahassee representing the college, and I'm sure tuning into this feed, and our more than 120,000 students, welcome to this special presentation of Miami-Dade College. This morning, we're extremely proud to present the latest installment of the acclaimed and popular Mike Fernandez Global Business Leadership Series. Our speaker this morning is Mr. Doug Levine, founder and CEO of Crunch Fitness, co-founder and chairman of Fridababy, founder and CEO of Big Move Properties, and CEO of Matus, to name a few. He'll be formally introduced in just a moment by a wonderful friend and longtime college collaborator, Mitchell Kaplan, who will also lead today's conversation here on the stage, and it's going to be a good one. Mitchell, of course, is the co-founder of Miami Book Fair and an internationally renowned bookseller with his unparalleled books and bookstores. He's also the past president of the American Booksellers Association and the recipient of the Literarian Award from the National Book Foundation, and in recent years, a film producer as well. Before Mitchell gets things going again, I want to once again thank the amazing community leader and benefactor of this series, Mike Fernandez, who's likely tuning in. You know, Mike is a pillar here in Miami and a college benefactor whose family name graces our acclaimed School of Business based out of the Kendall campus. He's also the generous funder of this series. It's Mike's support over the last 3 years now of this series that has allowed us to bring to our students, to you, and to our community, thought leaders and disruptors and executives from companies such as IBM, Pepsi, Boeing, Visa, Microsoft, Facebook, Carnival, SAP, Cisco, Western Union, Amazon, MasterCard, Brightline, American Airlines, Cisneros, and a couple months back, we had disruptor Marcelo Clar of SoftBank, another college partner. What an impressive list of thought leaders, and we're going to continue that today. So thank you very much, Mike, for all you're doing, and if you're listening, we hope to see you soon. And now it's my pleasure to hand things off to Mitchell Kaplan. Mitch?
Thank you all. It's so good to be here at Miami-Dade College. I'm very involved, as Juan said, and thank you, Juan, for that generous introduction. As some of you might know, I'm very involved with the book fair, and last year the book fair was virtual. This year we're going to do the book fair as a hybrid virtual, but we're also going to do it in person. And it felt so good to be walking onto this campus. I haven't been on the campus, it seems like forever, but to see all of you here and to know that we're getting back, we're coming back as a community, makes me feel really, really wonderful. And particularly to be here this morning, I'm a huge fan of Mike Fernandez, who Juan spoke about, and the person who sponsors this series, a wonderful asset in our community. And of course, the president of Miami-Dade College, Madeline Pumariega, is someone that I've known for years and years and years, and we're so lucky to have her leading this remarkable institution. And we're also really fortunate to have Doug Levine here today. I have to admit, Doug and I are friends. I first met Doug and got a sense of exactly who he was and what he does just sort of out of the blue. And this is kind of the way Doug works. I was in a bookshop that we had on Miami Beach, and I was introduced to him and we had lunch. And you know, the kind of questions that I didn't know Doug that well then, but the kind of questions that Doug was asking me about my business told me that I was in the presence of somebody very, very special. He wears his signature t-shirts, but there is nothing too casual about the way Doug operates his business. Doug, many of you know, as Juan pointed out, that Doug started Crunch Fitness in 1989 in New York City. And he started it with $5,000. And he ended up many years later, selling it to a private equity firm for much more than $5,000. And then Doug and his wife, Kaisa, moved here to Miami Beach, where they both made Miami Beach their home, raising two really lovely children as well. But Doug's got his fingers in a lot of different kinds of things. You've heard the phrase serial entrepreneur. Well, that's Doug. When I speak to Doug, I'm always learning about some new kind of business that he has just zoned in on. It's one of the most exciting times that I have, is having these intermittent conversations with Doug. At one time, he told me about this new thing that he was importing with his wife from Scandinavia. It was a new kind of baby product that was really hot in Sweden, but it hadn't yet been introduced here in the United States. So what did he do? He started a company called Fridababy, right? This company, from that one product, you know it, from that one product, that became a huge company selling to 35,000 stores nationwide. And then Fridababy was then sold in 2017 to a private equity firm. And if I tell you, the other thing about Doug, and we'll talk a little bit about it, is Doug's not just one of these guys who sits in an ivory tower and says, okay, that's a good idea, that's a good idea, and then he gets other people to do it. What Doug does is, Doug is in the warehouse packing boxes and shipping out, and he works with a group of people who do the very same thing, but then he rewards them as really good entrepreneurs do, and they take a sense of ownership in the company. So mentorship is something that is huge for Doug throughout all of his companies. He's invested over 30 companies, all starting with a small amount of money and then growing them. And in fact, my conversation with Doug that day was, I could tell that we were discussing possibilities that we could start together. And then I was engaged with Doug in a small bookstore, in a small cafe idea that we started and tried to get off the ground. This was not one of his big successes, but I think that's because of me more than Doug. But I watched him work, I watched his mind work, and what was successful for me at that thing, at working on this, was what I learned. You know, I'm a former English major, I've opened a bookshop, that's all I've ever done, mostly. But to watch that entrepreneurial mind is what I hope we'll discuss a little bit today, so that you, as you go through your business careers, you'll understand what it takes to go from an idea, and it doesn't have to be a huge idea, to building it out into something much more broad and much more meaningful. Because meaning and having a sense of community is another thing that Doug merges with everything he does. So right now, for instance, Doug has a company called Big Move Properties, and he has taken and creatively adapted, in terms of reuse, over 25 buildings in the Miami area. Not only in Miami, but Wynwood, Little River, Allapattah. Doug is one of those treasures that we have in this community, that I am so glad that he made that decision after leaving New York to make Miami his home, because he's made all of us richer for it. So please welcome to the stage, and the virtual stage, Doug Levine. So Doug, I mean, I think what we can start with is, and what a lot of particularly young people always want to know, is tell us a little bit of the road from there, not to here, but to your first major success with Crunch.
Sure. Can you hear me? Everybody can hear me? Good. So I worked on Wall Street in Silicon Valley, in San Francisco, in the mid-1980s at an investment bank called Montgomery Securities. And it was a very creative place. We were financing early biotech companies, financing early software companies, so on and so forth. But it wasn't really rewarding. You were financing somebody else's dream. It wasn't your company. It was their company. And you were just sort of telling the story and raising money on Wall Street. And I always had this idea of starting my own business. And when in the late 1980s, you know, because of technology, you know, in the early 1980s and prior to that, you apprenticed at a company for a long period of time. There wasn't computers, there wasn't a lot for young people to do right out of the gate.
I have to interrupt you just for a second. You guys have to understand there was a time before computers. Before cell phones.
Right.
If I wanted to know about what Doug was all about, I'd have to call him up.
Yeah.
There was no way to find out anything.
So young people in those days, when they worked at companies, you know, apprentice for 2-3 years, there wasn't a lot of meaningful work, and then eventually got into your career. But as the 1987, 88 came around with the advent of computers, young people were engaged in corporate America right away. And they were working hard. And I created a fitness environment that was a great place for them to let out steam. It was called Crunch. It was all very inclusive. It wasn't like previous health clubs, which were, if you wanted to look good, come here, or we look good, or the good-looking people come here. It was a place where all different kinds of body types, all different kinds of people from all different kinds of background were welcome. And our tagline was no judgments. And the idea was that this was this environment that you could thrive in and feel comfortable in. And that was sort of the mantra. And the idea was to create creative classes. So we were the first ones to do spinning. We were the first ones. We had a gospel aerobics class on Sunday morning. We had all sorts of avant-garde stuff that really resonated with the population. But we understood who our audience was, which was very often recent college graduates moving to cities where they were away from their family and felt very much alone. So we tried to foster this sense of community that would make them feel comfortable. And that's, I think, to the core of why the brand succeeded. And we built into that image and started, and this is what I'd really like to say, we started the business with under $10,000 in a one-room aerobic studio in the West Village with carpet on the floor, mirrors, and no air conditioning, just a fan. And I was so naive to believe, I didn't know how ventilation worked. So you could, you know, it's one thing to blow a fan and to cool you, but unless there's something extracting the hot air, the place steamed up like, you know, you couldn't see, and there was dripping wet. So the point of me telling you this is that most people start companies and they have to be perfect. And they're working a year, 2, 3 years on their business plan. And I would argue that although it's nice to think forward, that sometimes just getting in the game is the way to go. So clearly I didn't think about ventilation. You know, after the room steamed up, we had to get exhaust fans, and subsequently, many, many years later, our budget for building these gyms wasn't $10,000. We were building them for $3 million plus. So they've evolved over time. But the lesson here, or the tidbit I want to share with you, it's better to get in the game and to make mistakes and to correct those mistakes than to sit for a year plus deciding you're not ready, you're not ready, you're not ready.
Doug, talk about, because you and I have talked about, and even in our little cafe that we did,
yes,
it was really important talk about the importance of being hands-on.
Mm. Yeah, so you know, Mitchell references it, and it's really true. You learn everything by being involved in the business, absolutely everything. You learn from your customers what they like, what they don't like. You learn what makes them feel good. Absolutely everything. I mean, there was a story when we started Fridababy where we took this nasal aspirator from Sweden and imported it into the United States, and we changed the packaging. And my wife went door to door to doctors' offices and said, "Hi, I'm Kaisa. Have you tried the nose Frida?" And she would push her way in there and she would demonstrate this to any doctor that would listen. And this was a product that was completely unknown outside of Scandinavia, and they had one distributor in Poland. So we took back then a Yahoo store and we skinned it with Fridababy graphics. We had a graphic artist do it at a modest thing. And we would, every time there was an order, there would be like a yellow star, a white star. And my wife would get all excited. We have an order. Okay, it was an order for one nasal aspirator. That's how modest this company was in the beginning. So she got an order. She had some doctor that was selling this product that somehow she met at a trade show in Indianapolis, Indiana. And she gets an order from Indianapolis, Indiana on the website. So she calls the person up and says, "Look, I know I'm going to send this to you, but it's going to take 2 or 3 days. If you want to get it down the street 5 miles away from you, if your son or daughter is sick, Dr. So-and-so in Indianapolis is carrying it in his office." And to Mitchell's point, that kind of hands-on stuff is the thing that is legendary, absolutely legendary. If you read the book by the guy that started Zappos, he talks about customer service being the be-all, end-all. And he says that you cannot disappoint a customer. There's no request that a customer has that will not be fulfilled by Zappos. And he talks in the book about sending the guy 3 pizzas. Because would that make you happy? Good, you're going to get 3 pizzas, and you get to keep the shoes. So the hands-on aspect, you learn everything about your customers, you learn more about your company, and the myth and the legend and the culture grows by being responsive. And it's been like that for me for every single company. And it's, to this day, people will say, before a showing, when I'm trying to lease space, I'll be sitting outside a space sweeping the garbage off the stoop. And some people make fun of me, and so be it. And other people admire it. And the truth is probably somewhere in between.
Well, and also what it does, that kind of hands-on idea gives you a sense of costs. It helps you figure out the whole idea of ventilation.
Sure.
What needs to happen.
Sure.
So that's what I think it also does. Doug, talk a little bit, define what an entrepreneur really is. I mean, a lot of people throw that word around. What is an entrepreneur?
Well, if you're an entrepreneur, you have to be curious, okay? You have to be curious. And if you go in this into this world, it's a fascinating thing, right? I didn't know what PR was when I started Crunch. I thought that Elle magazine was Ellie, okay? And we started this fitness brand, and then in a short period of time, we were designing these classes that would get noticed by Vogue, Elle. We had our own television show on VH1. We had a Crunch show on ESPN2. And we sort of invented this idea of avant-garde classes as a differentiation for Crunch. So what is an entrepreneur? An entrepreneur has an idea. They want to start something. They don't necessarily have all the skill sets. What are the skill sets? You've got to know eventually about accounting. You need to know about management, about HR. You need to know about marketing. You need to know about design. If you're manufacturing a product, about manufacturing, production, fulfillment. It's so multifaceted. And to Mitchell's point, you know, you don't have to be an expert at all of these things, but you have to be curious about them. And the best entrepreneurs are curious about all these things. And they're pushing the architect to be better, the graphics person to be better, the PR and the programming to be better. So you want to not ever have this off-standish approach of, oh, just talk to my accountant. No, you should understand the numbers. You should understand the numbers. You should understand, hey, air conditioning systems need to blow cold air in, but they also have to take hot air out. And you have to be a good entrepreneur, I believe, you have to be curious about all these things. You don't have to be the guy that comes up with the name. You don't have to be the guy that comes up with the logo. But you have to be curious about the process, and you have to push people to get the best that you can possibly get out of them. And if you can do all of that, it's in the most amazing career in the world, because it's everything. It's creative, it's operations, and operations are creative. It's every single aspect of this, and it can be done. It absolutely can be done. You just have to be very ambitious, and the best way to do it is, you know, very often to work for somebody who's a terrific entrepreneur, and to keep your eyes and ears open. That's the best way to do it. Another way to do it, which is much less entrepreneurial, is to work for or start a franchise business. So when you look at a franchise business, it is been sort of set up for you. The name's been created, the product's been created, the marketing's been created, the site selection. Think about Jiffy Lube, think about, you know, the tens of thousands of franchises out there. This has all been done for you. McDonald's, Burger King, they're largely franchised. So all of this has been set up for you. It's a different route, right? You're not the one coming up with the name McDonald's. You're not the one trying to decide whether there's a McRib sandwich or not next year. Okay, you're sort of executing on their vision. Not as entrepreneurial, more as a managerial kind of thing. But if you want to be an entrepreneur, it's probably better to work for an entrepreneur and to see how they start these things from scratch, how they get them off the ground, how they can often fail, and how to do it in a very cost-effective way. I argue that your idea should be a big one. So my sister wanted to start a cupcake shop. Okay, her kids had gone off to school, and she said, "What do you think of the idea?" And I said, "I don't really like it." She said, "Why is that?" And I said, "Because you have ambitions to do one cupcake shop, and you have the same risk that you do that's going to fail or not fail. But if it works, we're really going to have one cupcake shop. And if you were more ambitious and you had illusions of opening hundreds of cupcake shops, okay, even though I don't think it's the greatest idea, I would support you. But to have all that risk and not to have that dream of going for it in a much bigger way, I sort of advised her not to do it."
And with the decline of cupcake stores, probably a good idea. Okay, so what you just said begs two questions. The first one is, since we are talking to a bunch of students,
Yes.
what in school at the university level what kind of program, what are the kinds of things they need to be taking in school
Great question.
in order to then hook up with an entrepreneur at some point?
Listen, I'm in meetings with guys from, you know, high-end consulting firms, McKinsey, Harvard Business School, Harvard Law School graduates. And I feel very comfortable, and I don't break a sweat, because I have a sense of design. So, and we were talking about this before, I think that coming up with logos, figuring out why businesses work, how they make you feel, is not something that they teach you in these elite schools. So I would argue to take design classes. I would argue to learn things that sort of make you understand why something feels good. Why does this logo make you feel good? Why does this space make you feel good? Why does this web page make you feel good? I think that those are things that are unique skills that can be applied to entrepreneurship. And it's been, for me, Mitchell mentioned we bought all these buildings in Wynwood and Allapattah. Our ability to go in and redesign them and create these unique environments, we have no vacancy. We're getting higher rents than anybody else because the sense of design has created a differentiated product that people want. And I've used that not only in the real estate, but I've used it in everything that I've done. So I would encourage you guys, even though you're doing entrepreneurial stuff, is to take some design classes and to pay attention, is what I would, that's my secret sauce. And that makes me feel very comfortable in these, internal rate of return meetings, blah, 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 blah.
Okay, so that leads to the second question. So you've invested in over 35 companies you've started, companies you've invested in. What is it you look for when you're looking to either start a company or invest in a company? What are the kinds of benchmarks?
It's a great question, and it's very relevant to what you guys are doing. And this is what I tell people. Look at big, broad trends that you think are going, and this is very helpful in thinking about if you're going to start a company. It's very helpful, I think, in picking a job, in what career you're going to focus in. But what are the big, broad trends? Okay, we were talking this morning. In my view, the big, broad trend is that people are going to yearn to connect to one another. So I'm looking right now to invest in companies that are creating venues, okay? Music venues, art venues, any kind of venue. And I've invested, has anybody been to the Oasis in Wynwood? Anybody here? Yes? So what do you think of that as a venue? Is that unique to Miami, right? So that sort of thing is, I believe, going to catch on nationally. So I would argue that things like that are going to be a big, broad trend, and you're going to see more and more of that over the foreseeable future. Experiential stuff. I think that people are going to want to, I read an article, this is going back 8 years, I was sitting in an airplane magazine about the founder of Airbnb was stepping down as CEO to create Airbnb experiences. So when you're traveling now, okay, nobody really even talks about, oh, my Airbnb was, at the Spanish Steps. No, they talk about, I'm taking, all the things they can do on Airbnb experiences. We were in Valencia, we took a paella class as a family. My sister was in Denmark, she took a Danish pastry class. Art tours through Denmark, so on and so forth. So this guy created, as a side business off of Airbnb, this thing called Airbnb Experiences. And I think that that trend is huge going forward. So think to yourself, what are the things, you don't want to look back. You don't want to say, oh, Bill Gates made all this money as a computer programmer, I'm going to study computer programming. I think a few people have gotten that tip and have done that over the last 20 years. You want to look forward. What are the things that are going to be big, broad trends? And do I want to have a career or do I want to start something in that area? And I think that's the best advice that I can give you.
Which is great advice. And so along those lines, talk a little bit about what you've done in Wynwood and Allapattah, and a lot of these things that you just talked about informed why you went into those areas.
Sure. Yeah, so when we started Fridababy, we fulfilled the nasal aspirators out of our house, and we could only pack. We got into Target, the big be-all end-all in consumer goods, and we were fulfilling on these pallets, and we could only do it on a sunny day in our driveway because they didn't fit in the garage. So we had to pick a sunny day. And so the people that were working with me said, we got to get a warehouse. And we bought our first warehouse in Wynwood. Everybody thinks that my real estate was so strategic, but it really was because Fridababy was taking off, and we bought our first warehouse in Wynwood. And lo and behold, Urban Outfitters and everybody else came and said, this is a cool building, can we rent it from you? So I kept buying and buying buildings as a result of this first one that we built that we bought in Wynwood. And over time, it was a lot of fun because it was the same sort of creative outpost for me. Anybody been to Love Life Cafe in Wynwood on Fifth Avenue? Yes? Yeah? Yes. Okay, so behind that, I mean, that was Mitchell had a shop there at going back like.
It was called Books and Bikes. It was in one of Doug's buildings. He said, "Give it a try, see what it's like." This was very early, probably a little too early.
Way too early.
But it was a cool concept.
But if you go there today, since we've actually redesigned the whole, it's a campus, and it has a coding school, a vegan cafe, it has a Haitian restaurant that's called Manje that's about to open, has an amazing music listening bar called Dante's Hi-Fi, which just opened up last weekend, and it really is this unique campus that with 4 or 5 ways to get into it, and was very, very creative in terms of how all the shops and all the venues interact with one another. So that's an example of using creativity, design, applying it to real estate, and people like it. 1 + 1 is more than 2, and everybody wants to be there. As a matter of fact, they built this giant building right behind it because they thought it was this unique campus. So.
That's cool. You know, the nice thing is we've got some questions, I think, from the audience.
Perfect.
So why don't we ask this audience here first, since you're here. Do we have any questions from any of you? There's a mic in the back. So if you have any questions, feel free to wander up to the mic. Meanwhile, I'll ask questions of the people out in virtual land. But feel free to go over to the mic and I'll call on you when you're there if you do have a question. Mike, there is a question from Marjorie C., and she's asking, what advice would you give to an entrepreneur who is afraid of scaling an idea they have worked on for more than 15 years? So fear, how do you overcome that fear of some sort?
I think you just do it, and you realize that, I call it, you meet, we used to joke that entrepreneurs have this dream of catching their big break. They'll meet somebody at a dinner party, they'll get a card from the guy that runs Disney or Microsoft, and they'll walk around with it for 2 years, and they're not ready to present their idea to that person. I think that is wrong thinking, and I think you've got to take your best shot. And you get the person on the phone, you pitch them, and they tell you they love the idea, they hate the idea, or I don't like the idea because, and it's all for learning. It's all for learning. When I started Crunch, we were doing a paid in full business model where you would pay for the year up front. And then on your anniversary date, a year later, we would try to renew that membership. We'd say, Mitchell, your membership is up, would you join for another year? And friends of mine in the investment world said that will never fly. You need to go to a monthly dues model where nobody really has an anniversary that they can cancel. And that was a big challenge because you were taking this money up front and using it to open the next gym. And when you had to go to this monthly model, there was never this big upfront money that you were taking. So I sort of came up with a game plan to wean ourselves off of this paid in full model over a 3-year period. So the year afterward, we'd say, okay, let's do 60% still paid up front, 40% recurring. And then the next year, let's do, I'm making it up, 70%, 30% paid up front, and 70% until eventually we weaned ourselves off of it and it became very successful. I wouldn't have known to do that had I not sort of pitched our business idea to people in the investment world who said, you got it all wrong, okay? And that's fine. And so to answer Marjorie C's question, I think 15 years is a long time to decide that you're not ready or not sure if you can scale, and I would just argue that just get in the game and give it a try.
You have a question, a young man in the back.
Well, can you hear me?
Sure.
Yeah.
You talked about how to be a great entrepreneur. You need to have something like a mentor working for a great entrepreneur. But do you think is it better working in a big corporation like you did on Wall Street in Silicon Valley?
My firm had 100 people. It wasn't a large corporation. It was sort of a renegade small investment bank. But and I didn't really get anything of a mentorship opportunity there. But that's not true. What I learned on Wall Street eventually is what a good business model was, what's investable and what investors will pay for, different quality of earnings. Recurring revenue is better than upfront fees. Things like recurring revenue software, much better than hard goods where you have to resell the customer all the time.
So you learn the theory there.
You learn the theory in there, and you learned the real entrepreneurship in the game.
Gotcha.
In the game. But you know, if you think strategically, you can still today start companies with relatively tiny bits of money. And that's what I want people to leave here thinking about. You know, it's one thing to come up with a pitch book and say you need $1 million and you're willing to give away 1/3 of your business. But there are, you know, and that's one way to go, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there are ideas out there that can be created from scratch with much, much less money.
Thank you.
I think what you're also talking about, and I think working working with Wall Street, working with the investment banker, it was also a quality of life decision you made to make a change. Talk about a little bit of what quality of life has to do with the decisions you make as a business person.
As young people, you've got to decide what kind of life you want to have. There are jobs, and the biggest error that people make is they take jobs because they pay the most money. Okay, that was an error that I made, and Mitch is pointing it out. Wall Street pays you the most money quickly. Typically away from Wall Street, sales pay you the most money quickly. And a lot of young people go into Wall Street or into sales because it's the quickest way to earn money. And everybody needs money to live. But over time, okay, I would argue you should do what you love, okay? And there's no way in the world that you can't succeed at what you love. In the most competitive world of all, making movies. You know, every young person wants to make film. The jobs are impossible to get. You have to know somebody to get the jobs. They're impossible to get. I would argue that if that is your passion, that you should go and work on a lot in Hollywood, cleaning up the floors, okay? If you're supposed to be there at 8 in the morning, you get there at 7. You're supposed to leave at 5 at night, you leave at 6, and do what you have to do at night to earn extra money. and kill yourself. I would guarantee you, within 18 months of doing that, you'll be noticed, and somebody will say, hey, I want you to come work as an assistant grip, okay? And then a grip, and then you're on your way. And so I would argue that you should do and follow your dream regardless of what it pays, and grin and bear it and sleep on your parents' couch or your friend's couch and go after your career and then exceed expectations. If you're supposed to be there at 9, be there at 8. You're supposed to leave at 5, you leave at 6, okay? And you do whatever it takes, and somebody will notice and you will move up the food chain. So that's a piece of advice that I would give you. And as opposed to taking that job that pays the most money today, that is not something that's sort of conducive to your dream, and it's not what you sort of set out. The time to take risk is while you're young. The time to take risk, and you can do it now. It will be painful. Nobody wants to get paid 9 to 5 to working 8 to 6. Okay, but if it's what you want to do, you want to know how you're going to get noticed. That's how you're going to get noticed.
There's a new book out now, which I think is really interesting. It's called The Passion Economy, and how many people have joined the passion economy and have been really successful at what they do. We have another question from Julian Alvarez, and the question is, Doug, this is a good one. Doug, how do you distinguish fleeting trends from new niches that are here to stay?
It's a great question. Trends are, what people are wearing, what people are doing in the moment. Sustainable things are, how does this make you feel? Okay? So, there are going to be lots of fads and trends, but a big, broad trend that I believe in, and I'll give you an example, is that the world is becoming more one. People in China, in India, all through Europe, Asia, all want their kids to see the world, okay? Everybody wants, so when you travel to Athens and go to the Acropolis, huge number of those people are not European and they're not American for the first time. Same thing in the Louvre in Paris, the same thing in Buckingham Palace in London. It's this big, big trend that as the world enters the middle class, the first thing that a middle class family wants is to have their family see the world. That's an example of a big, broad, sustainable trend that I don't see stopping anytime soon. Whether somebody is going to have this diet or that diet, I can't help you. That could be a fleeting thing. But there are these big positive trends that if you can think about them and position yourself to either have a career in them or to become an entrepreneur within that industry, will serve you very, very, very well.
Doug, what kind of, I feel like, what's her name, who's asking Sarah Palin the question, what kind of reading do you do on a daily basis to do this kind of environmental scanning? What is it that what do you look at? What do you read?
I walk my dogs an hour a day, and I listen to the most varied podcasts that you would ever imagine.
Could you give us some names?
Yeah, so How I Made This, some of the business ones. I was listening to the guy, Reed Hastings, the founder of Netflix?
Yeah.
On how he scaled his business. So every single day I listen to one or two very varied podcasts that 50% of their time are business trends and 50% of the time are off the beat things that I find, unique.
Just cultural stuff.
Cultural stuff.
So before, you've been using a word a lot. Before we go to this question, which we have in the room, talk just briefly and explain to all the students out there the notion of scaling a business.
So it's a great question. So I own a wetsuit company called Matus. We make very high quality Japanese geoprene material wetsuits. They're used, we don't use them here because the water's warm, but in Southern California, Northern California, and Oregon, Washington State, Japan. And so the idea, and I've owned this company for 3 years, and we've been tinkering around with it and trying to get it right, trying to get our distribution partners right, trying to get our design right, trying to get our apparel right, trying to get our distributors, everybody on the same page. So I think that the idea of scaling these companies, you have to become incredibly ambitious once you sort of have your team in place and you know who your customer is and you know that the product is right. So for the first time, having owned this thing for 3 years, we're going to be launching a kids line, a footwear line, we're going to be launching apparel, and all kinds of products because it's the blocks are in place. And the company that has not grown dramatically for 3 years becomes very complacent. Oh, well, we'll do 15 or 20% more next year than we did this year. And I'm saying, no, now we have it right. And now we can grow this thing 200, 300, 500% year over year. So you have to put the blocks in place, and then you have to be very ambitious. And you're killing yourself when you start a company. So incremental 20% growth, it doesn't buy it, okay? It doesn't work. You want to be very, very ambitious when you get it right.
So once you get it right, you swing for the fences.
You swing for the fences, and it's my job, okay, to push. My job to say, no, footwear next year, kids line next year, not in 2024, next year. And that's what you have to do. Because you have to have the confidence and you have to become very, very ambitious. And it's the entrepreneur and the CEO that has to chart that course. Everybody else, some people will be cautious, some people will not be, but it's your job when the time is right to become very ambitious.
Question in the back.
Yes, my name is Jonathan DeSouvre. I have the pleasure of serving as professor of entrepreneurship, and I want the students that are here are my students. I would love for them to give themselves a round of applause for just showing up. Right? Part of success is showing up. Right?
Sure.
One of the biggest parts. But you talked about success and growth. One of the things I know a lot of my students don't want to ask is about fear and failing, right? How do you, I have two questions, because I'm also a filmmaker as well. Last year I shot a film in the middle of the pandemic, and we won 9 awards, which was pretty exciting.
Congratulations.
And I never did a film before in my life, but we shot it here in Miami. But how do you deal, tell us about when you failed on something, and how did you fail forward without seeing yourself and your team as failures? So I'll say it again. Tell us about when you failed on something and not seeing yourself as a failure, because when you fail, you're not a failure. But tell us about that experience, please.
So I had started Crunch, and in the early 1990s, there was a competitive gym called Equinox, and they were doing, there was a slightly older and a slightly higher end customer, but they were doing personal training in huge, huge numbers. And we wanted to get into that business. And we tried in fits and starts. We tried with one one personal training director, didn't work, the next one didn't work. And we finally hired somebody, and it was a failure. It was absolutely a failure on 2 or 3 different occasions. And then I remember we hired this guy from Equinox, and he told us, hey, in Los Angeles, you're going to do, from memory, I can't remember, maybe it was $100,000 the first month, but you need to build me this personal training desk and so on and so forth. And we were in a union building on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles, and to do any construction was very, very expensive. So I went to the IKEA in Los Angeles. I bought 2 podiums, I think for $50 each. I put them in the middle of the room. And to build his personal training desk was like $100,000 with union labor. And I said, you make your number with these 2 podiums, and you'll get your personal training desk. And lo and behold, he did it. And then it became a huge piece of our business. So on the 3rd try of failing, we hired the right guy, okay, and it became a huge success. Not a great example, but you know, it happens. You know, I argue, and one of the things I try to teach people when they start festivals, music festivals, any kind of thing, is that it's going to start, and Mitchell knows this better than anybody, modestly. And that the goal has to be year by year, month by month, do whatever it takes to build upon that modest success. And Fridababy, if I told you that our first year we did $5,000 in business, and now it's owned by SC Johnson Wax, and it's a huge, huge company. But it started with the first year revenue under $5,000 or right then and there. And by sort of steady sticking with it, pushing that boulder further and further along, all of a sudden, and then these companies have their own momentum. All this work, all these returning phone calls, returning emails, all this stuff that you do, all of a sudden it starts coming the other way. People are calling you. Hey, do you want to open a crunch? Do you want to, you know, Walmart called, no, that's not true. That's true. Walmart called for us. She goes, I've never done this to a vendor. Would you like to sell Fridababy at Walmart? Well, yes, thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
You know, to speak to what you're saying as well, the whole notion of risking is really important, because if you don't take the risk, you can't learn, because you learn from failure as much as from anything else. So it's all about taking that risk and overcoming the fear of failure, but understanding that if you do fail, you can also learn and then grow. You can't grow unless you take a risk, because otherwise you just stay in a static state, or you sink in some way. So risking is really, really important, and that's really what Doug has done his whole career, take risks, but intelligent risks as well. There's a question from Denitra, and she's asking, Doug, and what do you think about this? What's your take on trademarking your name, brand, prior to seeing substantial profit?
It's a great question, and it's, you know, because we've started these companies with not a lot of money, we haven't spent a lot of time and energy marking these things. I'm a fan of seeing if you got something first. Everybody's trying to protect their idea. They don't want to show anybody their idea. Their idea is worth everything. And I would argue that that is wrong thinking, and that ideas are relatively cheap, and that the people in the world that are willing to take that idea and do what it takes to build companies are very rare. So that when people don't want to share their idea with me, I've got a zillion ideas. I don't have a zillion hours in the day to execute on these things. So I think in general, you see if you have something, and there's typically time once you see that you have something to trademark your name and your concept. So we've done extensive trademarks for Fridababy and for Crunch and for Matus, so on and so forth. But I would argue there'll be time, launch your idea, there'll be time to protect your idea, unless you have a huge budget, and then you can do it. I've never had that. I've always started very, very modestly. I want to see if I have something, and then I can protect my idea.
Because trademarking can be quite expensive.
It can be very expensive.
In the remaining time, we just have a few minutes left, and one of the things that's happened with, and I'm sure you've all seen it, and I notice it among a lot of young people, my own sons and daughter included, is the popularization of entrepreneurship, right? Through shows like Shark Tank. So for many people who've been introduced to entrepreneurship through Shark Tank, what do you think of it? How accurate is it? Should someone watch that as gospel?
I think it's changed America, it's changed the world. I think that young people, everybody's been exposed to Shark Tank. I think it's very accurate. It's a microcosm into sort of entrepreneurship. I think it's...
And how people think about
how people think, how investors think, how entrepreneurs think their ideas are worth more than often what investors think, and why there has to be a meeting of the minds, how certain things are investable, other things aren't, how an idea, ultimately how an idea gets executed. Mark Cuban always talks about it. I want a grinder, a guy that's going to go out and grind. A huge amount of this is grinding. A huge amount of it is grinding. And people don't understand. Like, if I'm driving to work in the morning and a guy opens a donut shop or a pizza shop, and I see him outside cleaning his window when I'm on my way to work, I'll say to somebody in my office, let's get donuts from there, or let's get a pizza from there today. That's how entrepreneurs think. So, they want to help other entrepreneurs. So when you're out there and you put that effort in, and you really, when I'm sweeping up in front of my buildings before I show it, some people laugh. I don't. I think it's the right way to wait. But Shark Tank is a real eye into how investors think, and it's very, very useful. And everybody's gotten this entrepreneurial bug. And to take entrepreneurial classes here, you might have gotten the bug. I would encourage you. I would encourage you to start your own businesses. I would encourage you to work for other entrepreneurs. I would encourage you to read about this stuff. We didn't have Shark Tank when I was starting out as an entrepreneur. So there was a book called Made in America by Sam Walton that talked about how he built Walmart. There was a book with just a swoosh by Phil Knight.
Shoe Dog, right?
Which he talked about. Okay. Right. These were the books that I read to teach me how entrepreneurs do it. Phil Knight talked about how everybody got a paycheck but him, right? At Crunch, everybody got a paycheck but me. I used to get a paycheck. Phil and I got his paycheck, but it was sat in his drawer because he couldn't cash it because everybody else had to get paid. I had a lady at the Chase Bank in New York City when I was doing Crunch, and I would beg her to meet my payroll on Friday. And she said, okay. And then I would bring the money from Friday and Saturday into the bank, and she would make sure that my paychecks didn't bounce to my employees. So she called me when we sold Crunch. It made the front page of the Wall Street Journal. She said, I always knew you were going to make it.
I've been there. I know that feeling. Doug, this has been just a lovely, lovely morning.
My pleasure. Thank you.
It's, all of you understand why every time I have a conversation with Doug, I find it so stimulating and edifying for me. And I'm so glad that you could share this with everybody.